Hello, everybody. I'm Mary Hayes Gordon. I am happy to welcome you to the second in our series of presentations sponsored by the New York State Underground Railroad Consortium. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Judith Wellman, who is here representing the Underground Railroad Consortium. Dr. Wellman?
Welcome, everyone. We are absolutely delighted that you can join us today for the second in our series of Underground Railroad programs in New York State. These are all sponsored by the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, which represents historic sites and programs throughout the state that interpret the Underground Railroad. The first one we did in this series was an overview of the Underground Railroad throughout the state to show changes in patterns and people and places over time. And the next few will focus on different topics and different historic sites and different events and people in New York State to give you a sense of some of the amazing and fascinating people in this very impressive region of the country. And I'll turn it back to Mary Hayes Gordon, our moderator par excellence.
Thank you, Judith. And I am going to ask Sage Hazarika, who we are grateful to be handling the technology, among other things, for these presentations. And I will ask Sage to introduce himself and give us a little information.
Thank you, Mary Hayes and Judith. Really happy to be here with everyone. So thank you to all of the guests. Really excited you're joining us today. As you've heard before, this is the second in an ongoing series that we're really excited to share with you all. Speaking of sharing, we will be recording today's session. So we just like to ask that everybody keep their microphones muted. If you happen to have joined us since I last said that, welcome also, but also keep your microphones muted. If you have questions for our presenter, Deirdre, we would kindly ask that you write down your questions or comments in the chat window. We will be looking at the chat window throughout the presentation, and Mary Hayes will bring in some of your questions during a 15 or so minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to hearing what you're asking of the presentation.
Thank you, Sage. So we're very fortunate today to have Deirdre Sinnott presenting for us. The title of her presentation is Hotbed of Abolition, Utica 1833 to 1836. Deirdre is an independent scholar, filmmaker, author, and social change activist, and she lives in New York City. She's currently working on a nonfiction book about the American abolition movement and Underground Railroad centered in Utica, New York. She also speaks about the lingering effects of racial injustice on society. She has an upcoming novel, The Third Mrs. Galway, set in Utica, New York, and it will be released in June 2021. It's set in Utica, New York in 1835. You will see a very important time here. Deirdre is also a member of the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission. So thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm really thrilled to see so many people and so many people I know and people I don't know. And thank you, Mary, for that nice introduction. Well, on 4 consecutive Sundays in November and December of 1832, in the basement chapel of the Western Reserve College, situated in Hudson, Ohio, a wholly committed Bible scholar preaches 4 fiery sermons. The subjects are: be good rather than be practical, give up prejudices, if you see a great wrong, you must act against it, and love thy brother. Those 4 innocuous sounding topics get Beriah Green forced out of the college because he isn't simply quoting scripture, he is preaching against slavery and about the bloody guilt that stains everybody who stands by and does nothing. By the way, at the time we're talking about, the Reverend is described by abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier as a fresh-faced, sandy-haired, rather common-looking man. So picture him as a young person just bursting with righteous energy. Green's next job is in Whitesboro, New York, at the Oneida Institute of Science and Technology, just down the road from Utica. Before he agrees to be president, he makes 2 basic demands: one, that he can continue to preach and teach abolitionism, the immediate end of slavery, and that any student who has reformist zeal and is willing to learn be admitted. The board agrees with some dissension, but that means that male students are welcome on an equal basis with no regard for their race. He arrives with his family in August 7th, 1833, and by doing so adds enormous strength and enthusiasm to the burgeoning abolitionist feeling among some in Utica. The first anti-slavery society in New York State, organized on abolitionist principles, is formed by the students at the Oneida Institute. Green uses any approach he can to preach against the sin of slavery, and like while traveling, he helps organize anti-slavery societies in Syracuse and in Rochester. And in early December 1833, he's made the first president of the newly created American Anti-Slavery Society at their convention in Philadelphia. So he's gaining a reputation, a national reputation. So we have radical abolitionist Reverend Beriah Green firmly installed in Utica, Whitesboro area. Now I'm sure obviously everybody here knows what abolitionist stood for: immediate emancipation of enslaved people with no compensation to the slaveholders, or an immediate awakening to doing something to end slavery. But you may not be as familiar with the idea of sending free Black people to Africa. After Britain outlawed the transatlantic trade in human beings in 1807, they established a colony in West Africa. They used Sierra Leone to repatriate people who they found on illegal slave ships after having been kidnapped from Africa. Also, the British brought some of the so-called Black loyalists there, those who had gone over to the King's side during the American Revolution. Granville Sharp, British campaigner for the abolition of the slave trade, was considered the founder of the colony at Sierra Leone. But in the United States, the official movement for having a colony in Africa of former slaves and free African Americans was laid out by Paul Cuffey. He was a successful Quaker ship owner and an abolitionist who was for resettling some Black Americans in Africa. He was half African, half Native American. In 1815, he brought 38 Black colonists to Sierra Leone and laid some of the basis for expanding the practice. He believed that overwhelming racism in the United States meant that in order for people to have a chance at a full and free life, they needed to leave. He envisioned cross-Atlantic commerce from the colonists there, not the wholesale exile of the free Black population. He died, unfortunately, before he could return to Africa with others. 1 year later, Robert Finley, a Presbyterian pastor from New Jersey, founded the Society for the Colonization of Free People of Color of America, which became known as the American Colonization Society. The board of the society was dominated by slaveholders. The society was the mainstream and acceptable opposition to slavery. They believed that Black Americans should be in Africa. Many were for the withering away of slavery. Some thought that the South would give their main source of wealth voluntarily. Some members were in genuine opposition to slavery and wanted it to end either through self-liberation, immediate emancipation, or by state legislation. But there's also racists in there who couldn't tolerate Black people, and slaveholders who found society handy because they wanted to get rid of the population of free African Americans who they saw as a potential organizer of a general insurrection. In 1822, the American Colonization Society began sending African American volunteers to the Pampas coast of Africa to form colonies that would eventually become the country of Liberia. They won support from Congress and closely controlled the situation there until Liberia declared its independence in 1847. The African American reaction to the removal was swift. In 1817, just a month after Reverend Finley founded the organization, about 3,000 people of color jammed Philadelphia's Mother Bethel Church. Benjamin Quarles described it in his book, Black Abolitionists, and I'm going to go on to that once I get. Can you hear me? Stage says that the audio is breaking up a bit. Is that happening for everybody? It's better now, he says. Okay, so this is how the meeting at Mother Bethel Church was described by Benjamin Quarles. James Forten, an important Black leader and abolitionist, stood before the audience. He called for the eyes of those favoring colonization. A complete hush was the only response, as if his listeners were taking a deep breath for a full-throated response in the negative. Forten then called for those who opposed colonization. One long, loud, tremendous "no" went up. Forten wrote, "It seemed as if it would bring down the walls of the building." Again and again, a majority of people of color rejected the idea. By 1833, there were already plenty of problems in Liberia. People who were transported there suffered greatly from tropical diseases like malaria. There were points when the mortality rate was as high as 50%. In this article from the Utica Whig, you can see that there were problems from early on, and please excuse the language used here and in other historical documents that I'm going to be quoting from. This is October 13th, 1835 from Liberia. It will be seen by an article taken from the New York Journal of Commerce that one of the Liberian settlements had been attacked by one of the Negro chiefs and utterly destroyed, with a loss of life of nearly every inhabitant. Some of the indigenous people who lived along the coast of Africa did not like the idea of having their land sold or stolen or being colonized. Ultimately, the Colonization Society transported about 15,000 people of color to Liberia. Out of that number, only about 4,200 were free people of color. The rest were enslaved people who had been manumitted under the condition that they go to Liberia, or people who were liberated from illegal slave ships. Danforth, on December 21st, 1833, the main agent for the American Colonization Society, Reverend Joshua N. Danforth, apparently a man of size, judging from several nasty jokes in the newspaper, came to Utica to give his stump speech supporting colonization, as he had done in October in Albany with much success. A few days before the talk, he met with supporters of colonization at the Dutch Reformed Church in Utica, and they planned his visit. He would have expected to do what he'd done in other towns and cities, give a detailed and stirring talk about colonization and how it is the vehicle for ending slavery slowly, carefully, and without disrupting the slaveholding South. The plan for Utica seems to have been that on the first night, a draft of a resolution would be discussed and settled upon. I think it was a boilerplate kind of thing with language tweaks done at each location. On that night or on the second night, Danforth would give the greater part of his argument. The Reverend also wanted pledges of funds to be raised for the society, as well as any ready cash that could be collected. Ultimately, there would have been a vote on the resolution, and the one in Utica stated this: that this meeting deeply deplore the unfortunate condition of the colored population of this country and condemn to the zealous support of the philanthropist and Christian American Colonization Society as the instrument under Providence which is best calculated to ameliorate the condition of the free Negro and secure the ultimate emancipation of the slaves. Danforth articulated his arguments in 12 reasons why all the people of New England should engage heart and hand in supporting colonization, the Colonization Society. His argument is at its core this, and I warn you, there's some insensitive and racist language in here. The Colonization Society encourages engagement with slaveholders in the South so as not to antagonize them, but to engage them. They will not be able to give up their enslaved people if there's no place for them to go. Indeed, in some places, there were laws against freeing people, and sometimes large bonds were demanded from slaveholders to ensure that the person released would act properly. By engaging masters, they could show that white workers who would be hired and fired on a seasonal basis were cheaper and they would be more productive. The society urges thought, discussion, plans, contributions for the benefit of the colored people. In the Liberia colony, people of color will be able to vote, have laws written by themselves, act as judges, sit on juries, something that they will never be able to do in the United States. The colony will both retard the slave trade and have products to sell the market rather than slaves. The society will be a moral lever under the foundation of the slave system, which it must eventually effect its overthrow. Removing free blacks will reduce the temptation to idleness, insubordination, and insurrection. So that's Danforth's argument. He's got a lot of good points that I've seen that probably were very, very compelling to his audience. So 7:30 p.m. New Year's Eve, 1833. The discussion started at the Dutch church here. It ultimately moved to the Bleecker Street Church, and the First Presbyterian Church. So at 7:30, New Year's Eve, 1833, the resolution is laid out. On the second night, Reverend Danforth assumed the podium to give his stump speech. Normally, this might have been the night that the resolution was voted up or down. But in Utica, on that early January evening in 1834, things must have gone a little differently than they had in other towns. Somehow it is decided that Beriah Green will be allowed to answer Danforth's points over 2 nights. It could be that he stood up in an open discussion period to make his case, and he was smart, and he might have convinced the body that he needed to be heard. I find it very interesting because just a few months before, Robert S. Finley, the son of the founder of the Colonization Society, spoke in Utica at the First Presbyterian Church, the largest of these 3 venues, and Finley talked for 2 evenings with no opposition reported. And Green was familiar with Reverend Danforth and his arguments. He had alluded to that gentleman's opinion in the 4 sermons that got him removed from Western Reserve College. When Reverend Green gets his chance, he counters with arguments too numerous to characterize here, but here's a few. Has not the North helped establish slavery? Is not the North doing certain things to maintain slavery? To do nothing is a choice to support the ills of slavery. If one is silent, then they are allowing slavery to continue unopposed. Prejudice against African Americans has its origin in slavery and needs to be maintained by slaveholders to keep the slaves and free Black people down. In the name of preserving the Union, people are being kidnapped in daylight and held in horrible prisons before they're sold into the misery of slavery. In the name of preserving the Union, the rights of people are being trampled. There's a tax on the mail, there's a tax on freedom of speech and the right to assemble. Vast amounts of capital are needed to prop up the system, and we are all paying those expenses. Violence underlies the entire system. Southerners fear the truth will come out, books are banned or altered. What system is so shaky that a paragraph in a book can stop it? American slavery is a fraud, adultery, murder. All humans are born free and must be enslaved. The laws of the South make human beings as chattel. The enslaved are children of God, same as us. As the days go on, the public swarms to these events. Each night, the crowd grows larger. And by the way, these audiences are made up of Black and white men and women. During the week of January 6th to 11th, the supporters of the colonization speak, presumably to answer Green's point. The meeting has moved to the bigger venue of the Bleecker Street Church. In addition to, in support of abolition and apparently temperance, Alvin Stuart Esquire speaks. He is the only full-out supporter of Green that I've found who took part. At the Common Council, Utica Common Council's regular meeting, they passed the following resolution to try to silence the supporters of abolition. It starts, whereas the citizens, certain individuals now in our city are disturbing the peace and good citizens thereof by inculcating sentiments which we deem demoralizing in themselves and little short of treason towards the government of our country. Therefore, resolve that we, the Common Council of the City of Utica, regard the agitation of the question on Negro slavery as it exists in the southern states of this republic to be highly inexpedient at present juncture of our national affairs, that it can only tend to keep alive the dying embers of internal discord, which we fondly hope will be soon entirely extinguished, if not disturbed by the zeal of misguided philanthropists. We heartily disapprove of all measures calculated to interfere with the rights of our Southern brethren, to them by the Constitution of the United States. And frankly, this debate is national news. It's in New York City. It's in the New York City papers and in abolition papers. On Monday, January 13th, 14 days after the beginning of the debates, before an audience estimated to be 2,000 people, Alexander B. Johnson, a wealthy man, former slaveholder, and public intellectual, speaks. He takes an interesting tact. It's not neither abolitionist nor colonizationist, and he publishes his own talk. And Greene had advised against that because he uses some very racist sentiments about the African-American community in there. That same night, Danforth's resolution is put to a vote and the motion carries. The Journal of Commerce reports that there were people of color at the event, asserting that most of them voted for the resolution. But how they voted or how they felt they had to vote is not the most significant part. The presence of African Americans at the meeting was significant enough for the paper to report it. It's not unusual for public meetings to be segregated at this time. It shows that the Black population of Utica is engaged in the debate. It also counters a characterization by Reverend Danforth that free people are basically engaged in, to quote him, idleness, insubordination, and insurrection. 2 days later, January 15th, a white mob builds 2 straw effigies of Greene and Stuart. The effigies are hung on a gallows. Across the top are alleged quotes from Greene and Stuart about anti-slavery and temperance. The Utica Observer reported that Greene had said that the Constitution of the United States was a constitution fit only for devils. A barrel of tar is produced and rolled with the gallows through the streets while people blow horns and rattle bells. Effigies are tarred and feathered and set on fire, along with issues of the newspaper, The Temperance Recorder. The rioters celebrate the mock death and funeral of the Friends of Abolition and dance around the fire in a state of drunkenness. The riot rages up and down Genesee Street. No one is arrested and no public authority stops the riot. Oswego Free Press, January 29th, 1834, a disgraceful riot took place in Utica Wednesday evening when a couple of gentlemen were burned in effigy. It seemed that a portion of the citizens had become very excited by the course taken by these persons in the cause of anti-slavery and intemperance. And Danforth is very proud of winning the vote at the end of this debate. It's even alluded to in his obituary. He went on to become a well-known pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church of Alexandria, Virginia. He resigned from the Colonization Society in 1834, but 3 decades later, he went back in 1860, and he died in 1861. So later in 1834, the Utica Anti-Slavery Society was founded with Alvin Stewart at its head, and Beriah Greene is deeply involved, as are many others. Now, I was completely ignorant of how big the struggle against slavery was in the very early 1800s. Trust me, I was in Utica school system through 6th grade, then junior high and high school, just 10 miles away in Clinton, New York, and I never heard of any of this tumult. Slavery was a major thing on everyone's mind. Here were the options: do nothing and watch slavery expand into the territories, which it did in some places. End it gradually, giving slaveholders time to come around and ship people of African descent to Liberia, or end it immediately. I think that there were some proposals of some kind of segregated colony in the United States west of the Mississippi, and also the idea that people would go to Haiti, which in 1804 had a successful rebellion of the enslaved and free people of color. The pressure to solve the problem of slavery was gathering, and a lot of that pressure was coming from the enslaved themselves. They were rebelling from the moment that slavery existed in the Americas. This is the first book that used newspaper articles to document the spirit and act of rebellion. It proved that resistance to slavery was widespread and consistent. Another pressure was in 1801, the invention of the high-powered steam engine that expanded the ability of engines to do work. It added pressure on slavery by making cotton production cheaper, thereby expanding the use of enslaved people. In the South, where the production of agricultural products was still yielding sufficient profits to keep slaves economically viable, the new engine sped up that production and expanded the number of acres cultivated for cotton. More powerful steam engines were one of the most significant advances in in the transformation of labor from small production on its way to mass production. Part of the reason the national government won the Civil War was because it had better production capabilities. Slavery, while profitable, was being outdone in terms of the manufacture of weapons and ammunition and supplies. So the age of the machine is coming. These massive steam engines also transformed the printing process. That meant that flyers and penny newspapers and abolitionist broadsheets could be mass produced. A mailing campaign of sending abolitionist newspapers to the slave states caused some Southern postmasters to refuse to deliver them. Instead, bundles of papers were thrown into harbors or burned. The local elite were nervous that these direct mailing of pamphlets and other materials would undermine their authority by outsiders in the form of abolitionist ideas. And direct mail would sidestep the elites, and their newspapers might make their way into the hands of already rebellious enslaved people. October 21st, 1835, the Utica riot. As I said, Alvin Stewart's effigy was burned alongside Uriah Green's in 1834. Utica at that time is not a huge place. It was bustling because of the Erie Canal, which you could see toward the bottom going straight through the middle of Utica. But look at this. This is Alvin Stewart's house with a green dot up at the top. And the red dots are active members or supporters of the Colonization Society. I mean, they're right on top of each other. In the summer of 1835, abolitionists in New York City decided that they want to hold a statewide convention to form the New York Anti-Slavery Society so as to consolidate the movement. They choose Utica precisely because Uriah Green and Alvin Stewart are there. August arrived and notices go up around Utica announcing the convention for the date of October 21st. And despite weeks of hostile denunciations and meetings and articles in many local, regional, and national papers vilifying the Anti-Slavery Society, hundreds of men show up at the Bleecker Street Presbyterian Church anyway. The meeting is called to order, and Alvin Stewart starts the business. I understand my audio is being terrible again. Is that true? There's nobody else. There's nobody else on here.
I can't, you're breaking up as well. You're breaking up again.
Okay.
You're
1
better
minute.
now. You're better
Okay.
now.
Yeah, that's something we gotta, it's better now
Yeah.
than sometime later.
Okay.
Why would that happen?
I'm just going to ask my husband to go turn off his computer. He's not even on it, but I'm going to ask him to turn it off. So I will be right back.
It sounds better, Deirdre.
Okay. Charles, can you please turn off your computer completely? Okay. He's going to do that. That's the only thing that could possibly be, or other than just. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sometimes if you take the Wi-Fi off of your phone, it could help as well.
Okay, I will do that. Airplane mode. All right. Now it's going to be perfect from this point forward.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So Stuart's standing up there. While he's there at the courthouse, a group from the Utica branch of the American Colonization Society pull themselves together to demand that the convention be disbanded. They form a committee of 25 and march to the church. Their membership was one of men of power, including gentlemen of property and standing in Utica. Let's look at the opposition. There's Samuel Beardsley. He's a leader of the Committee of 25. He's been in the New York State Senate, and at the time of the riot, he's a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Joseph Kirkland, mayor of Utica at the time, opposed to the convention, but he happened to be, luckily, out of town on the day of the riot. Very smart man. John Devereaux, he is a future mayor and a major merchant in Utica. Horatio Seymour, future mayor, then governor of New York State in 1853. J. Watson Williams, future mayor, and he is the Williams in Munson Williams Proctor Institute, a present-day museum lovely in Utica. Edmund Wetmore, he is a future mayor. His father, is a reverend and a Revolutionary War veteran, and he's an abolitionist, and he's inside the church while Edmund is outside the church. The Committee of 25 wasn't just these guys. There was a postmaster, the editor of the Utica Observer, an assessor, an alderman, a good number of lawyers, 3 members of the Common Council, a bookkeeper, a judge, and several men of business. They and a group of about 50 or so other gentlemen marched to the church, a crowd who's been whipped up by the stories in the newspapers and meetings gather around them. At the church, they managed to stop the Abolition Convention and cause a general disturbance. Let's meet some of the abolitionists who were inside. There was representatives from, I think, almost every county in the state. There were local abolitionists like James DeLong, member of the Common Council and Underground Railroad conductor, and Reverend Oliver Wetmore, who was a secretary during the convention. There's also Spencer Kellogg, who's a merchant. He becomes a very important mayor of Utica, and he plays part in the Utica Rescue, which we're going to be talking about. And then there's Charles Stuart. He's a Scotsman. He was born in Jamaica and apparently wore a lot of plaid. He's a tireless worker for emancipation and also the principal of the Utica Academy. He was drawn to the area by the Oneida Institute. After the riot that broke up the convention, he walked from Utica to Peterborough in the rain. He was trying to get there to Peterborough because that's where the convention was going to be reconvened the next day. And he was in an inn in Vernon and was awakened in the middle of the night by the innkeeper. A threatening mob outside demanded that he be brought out to them. And he told the innkeeper that he'd meet them in the morning, and he went back to sleep. Also at the meeting were several nationally known abolitionists. There's Louis Tappan, merchant from New York, had his own abolitionist newspaper. He and his brother were very rich merchants and did a lot of financing of abolition causes. Louis Tappan's known as part of the successful legal defense for the captives on the Amistad slave ship. With Tappan was brilliant African-American abolitionist David Ruggles. Ruggles was a writer and Underground Railroad conductor before the term was even invented. He found Frederick Douglass on the docks in New York City and took him in and helped him on his way. He also founded the vigilance committees, which became an active way for the African-American free community to protect themselves from being kidnapped by slave catchers and to help people who were escaping or who had been captured. In New York City, they also were at the harbor looking for illegal trafficking and people being transported from Africa or the Caribbean. And of course, Gerrit Smith of Peterborough. He began his day at the Utica Convention out of curiosity. He was a leading member of the American Colonization Society. It's important to know that during the disruption, he stood up and, outraged at the attack on the right to assemble, invited the body to come to Peterborough to continue the convention the following day. There they finished in peace. Within a year, Smith was no longer a member of the Colonization Society, but was a president of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. Beriah Green had been working on Smith, trying to get him changed into an abolitionist before the Utica riot, and all of that pressure worked. Harry Tubman came many times to Smith's house and ate dinner with his family. His house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. After the convention was disrupted, the mob broke into the abolitionist newspaper, The Standard and Democrat, and threw furniture and type out the window onto the street. They threatened people at their hotels and were generally running around town from Alvin Stewart's home down to the canal and beyond, and it was national news. The riot gave the leaders of Utica and the Committee of 25 back some relevance. The committee and their disruption may also have been part of a wider plan to prop up Southern support for Vice President Martin Van Buren. It's been rumored that he supported or at least didn't actively oppose the abolition cause. It can be seen as part of a string of activities by Van Buren, who was from New York State, and his supporters to prove that he was vehemently anti-abolitionist. The riot had reverberations in Utica. In my opinion, this incident, the Utica rescue, shows an increase in militancy in Utica after the riot. During summer of 1829, in Virginia's picturesque Shenandoah Valley, near the center of the village of Woodstock, John Geyer lay dying in his bed. It's been reported by one of his enslaved servants that he demanded a youth of 14 who had committed no offense be brought to his room, tied to his bedpost, and stripped so that he could whip him. At first, his wish was not obeyed, and Geyer cursed and swore and threatened those in the room. The child was brought in. The man, who supposed himself the owner of several people, took out a whip in his palsied hand and tried to flog the youth, but he was too weak and could only curse him. Before the summer ended, John Geyer was dead. His will reads, I, John Geyer, do make this my last will and testament as follows. First, he directs that his debts be paid. Then he goes on to say, I give and bequeath unto my beloved wife, Madeline, during her natural life and widowhood, all of my estate, both real and personal. During her natural life, that meant his wife, who we know as Mary, could use all of Geyer's goods, but upon her death, all would be passed to her heirs. Before John Geyer died, he and Mary had substance. They owned 2 houses in the center of town and had 2 properties and businesses, other properties and businesses to sustain them. At various times, they owned 10 pieces of property. They also owned a number of enslaved people. Moving forward to the summer of 1836, Geyer's wife, Mary, she's about 73 years old and she's ill. Her numerous nephews and nieces are waiting for her to die so they can inherit. She calls in 2 of her favorite servants, George, a young man about 22 to 25 years old, and Harry Bird, who's about 20 to 22. She's worried about them, and she urges them to run away so that they can't be sold after her death, and she gives them money and her blessing. Harry, Bird, and George begin their journey to freedom in early summer 1836. Their minds had to be on the 10 enslaved people that they left behind, and I don't know if they left wives or sweethearts or children, but I do know that the executors of John Geyer's estate put a $1,200 reward on George and Harry's heads. George and Harry probably followed the Valley Highway, which goes kind of northeast. It's now called Route 11. It still exists. You can go right down there. They followed it up through York and Lancaster to Philadelphia. There they could have met people, black and white, who were ready to help freedom seekers escape. They said that it was in Philadelphia where they met their first abolitionist. Before that moment, they believed that white men who helped slaves were another race of beings. After Philadelphia, they had to get past New Jersey. A string of towns across the state each have a documented abolitionist or Underground Railroad site as of 1835. A number of freedom seekers were sent by ship from Philadelphia around New Jersey to New York. Harry and George also mentioned that they stopped in New York City. So remember David Ruggles in New York City. One of the things that the Vigilance Committee also did was monitor Southerners who came in and brought enslaved servants into the city and informed the captives that after 9 months of living in New York, they were legally free. Ruggles could have been one of the people to direct Harry and George to Utica. He knew from his visit in 1835, he knew it was a stronghold in New York State. So let's turn to Utica. I don't know exactly how they got there or even why they stayed or where they stayed, but they say they arrived in September. Most of the African-American people who lived in Utica at the time lived on Post Street. This is not the entire African-American population, but you get the idea where people live. I wonder how many people in this community were in similar straits as Harry Bird and George. How many had been at the 1834 debates or the 1835 meeting and felt the heat of the riots? How many got to know Harry and George over the 4 months that they were in Utica? Okay, so Wednesday, December 28th, 1836, it's very cold. That time of year gets dark early and you would expect to find Utica covered in snow. Street lamps burned on the major thoroughfares. Paved streets were probably slick with ice. Anyone out would be bundled up, facing the elements. Sometime before 9 p.m., Ira Chase, a sickly man who served as constable, was in the company of 2 white men from Woodstock, Virginia. The 3 found and arrested Harry Bird and George. I don't know who tipped off the Virginians about Harry and George's location. It could have been that someone saw an advertisement in a Southern newspaper. They could have been betrayed by somebody they trusted. I'm looking for that answer. They were held overnight at the Watch House located under the Clinton Market, quite near the Black community. That same night, about 9 p.m., Joshua A. Spencer Esquire, a lawyer and future mayor of Utica, seems like everybody became a mayor, but sought out the judge of the Court of Common Pleas, Chester Hayden. Hayden was 47 years old and confident in his opinions. He'd been a judge in Oneida County since 1830 and would continue for years. His views on slavery were these, quote, "We admit that it was originally wrong to reduce men to slavery, but when we have them in our midst, incompetent to their right as citizens, should we discharge them from our care and let them perish through their inability to provide for themselves? If we must provide for them, is it not better for them and us that they should be provided for in the relations in which they now stand?" Spencer requested that Judge Hayden be at his court at 9 o'clock in the next morning, as two gentlemen from Virginia were planning to bring two fugitives before him. Hayden complied and was in his office on what he described as a frosty morning. A little after 9 a.m., Thursday, December 29th, 1836, Joshua Spencer walked into Hayden's second floor office/court in the company of the two Virginians. One was a shoemaker named Hosher, and the other one was Christian Miller, the jailer of Shenandoah County. Now, Miller was in his late 60s, perhaps 66 or 67. He was the grandson of two of the founders of Woodstock. He's described as a big man with a ferocious, cunning, cruel, Cain-like countenance. He's also a slave owner. By Virginia law, Miller, as jailer of Shenandoah County, must place advertisements like this one in newspapers describing any person running away from enslavement, so that the supposed owners could get that person back. Unscrupulous jailers skipped the advertisements and simply sold people and kept the money. And Miller did this, and I know in two ways. Harry Bird described Miller's process to Reverend George Storrs, a Methodist abolitionist who caught up with the men in Mexico, New York after they left Utica. The soul catcher had tried to persuade Harry to get his mistress to consent to being sold, saying, "Harry, if you'll be sold to me, I will give you $20 and I'll make you rich. I go to New York sometimes, and when there I gamble, and sometimes I lose $1,000 or $1,500. And then I go out and kidnap some colored people and sell them to the South and get money, and then go gamble again and get all my money back again and more too." I know Harry's account is true because Christian Miller was rebuked by the court in Virginia for doing just this. Christian Miller, jailer of this court, is to show cause why on information not be filed against him for receiving slaves into his jail without regular commitment, contrary to an act of the assembly entitled "An Act Concerning Jailing." Had the court having heard the evidence, it is ordered that said rule be discharged. So when Miller arrives in Hayden's court, he's ready to take George and Harry back to Virginia. He's engaged a wagon to get Hoosier, his captives, and himself to Bridgewater, about 25 miles south of Utica. There, waiting for them, will be a stage to Pennsylvania. All he needs is Judge Hayden to sign off on the papers, and he would be on his way to Virginia with his valuable captives. But there's a problem. Utica isn't all that large. Okay, here you have Judge Hayden's office. That building's still standing. Here's Spencer Kellogg's store. I think it was a different building, but it's a close approximation. And here is abolitionist Alvin Stewart's law office. On that frosty morning, abolitionist and grocery store owner Spencer Kellogg was informed by a man unknown to us that Constable Chase had arrested two men as fugitive slaves. Kellogg saw another abolitionist, Lewis Lawrence, on the street, and as they talked, they watched the constable drive by in an open coach with two men of color. The constable stopped at Judge Hayden's and took the two captives upstairs. Lawrence rushed up to Hayden's courtroom and returned to report that the men were caught, quote, stealing potatoes. Kellogg had heard differently, so he and Lawrence proceeded back up to Hayden's court and saw that all was not right. Kellogg asked Judge Hayden why the proceedings were being kept secret and who was to testify in the matter. Hayden suggested that secrecy was so that there was no useless excitement, explaining that Christian Miller and Mr. Hoosier were ready to testify. Lawrence left to get the abolitionist lawyer Alvin Stewart, and Kellogg told the judge that a counsel for the defendants was on his way and the proceedings were halted. Meanwhile, word has started to spread. And very soon after that, Hayden described the crowd that has gathered inside his court as numerous. Alvin Stuart arrives, he asks for a delay. The hearing, for various reasons, is set to reconvene at 6:30 p.m., and it's agreed that George and Harry will be held in the back room of Judge Hayden's office. So word spread. In the late afternoon, the street and the stairway of the Hayden office building were packed with people. Christian Miller became alarmed when he saw the colored people collecting in the evening and suspected their design. Being himself in the room with the claimed fugitive, said, "Let them come in, I've got pistols." A man in the room said in reply, "If you fire those pistols, we shall all be used up so that there's not a grease spot left of us." About 6 o'clock in the evening, a crowd assembled around the door and on the stairs of Judge H's office. A signal was at length given. The lights were extinguished, and a number of Negroes and white men made a rush for the room in which the prisoners were confined. When the door was opened, the constable struck one of the colored men who entered the room with his cane, a tremendous blow upon the head. The cane was quickly out of his hand and in 2 or more pieces. The constable was picking himself up in one corner of the room. One of the colored men, George, meanwhile had passed out the door, but Harry was cornered by the big soul catcher and held onto. But Harry, who had calculated to die at all events before he would be carried to Virginia, seeing the door open, made a death struggle to free himself from the inhuman monster that held him. Harry's hand, a very large one, seemed to increase in weight, and while hope sprung in his soul of seeing the open door, letting it fall on the soul catcher's head, it left Miller looking at the floor somewhat in a hurry, and they were whisked away. Chances are Harry and Bird went up through Peterborough, maybe before stopping in Mexico. Peterborough, I speculate. Mexico, I know. Reverend Storrs caught up with them in Mexico, and at the end of his report, he says, "These 2 men are, I trust, now beyond the reach of American cannibals. Probably by tomorrow morning, they will be in Canada." So let's go back to Woodstock for a second. On February 21st, 1837, the widow Mary Geyer dies. A few weeks later, the executors of her estate put a notice of sale of her personal property as well as her late husband's property and real estate. The sale was held at the residence of Mrs. Mary Geyer, which was within sight of the courthouse. It reads beds, bedding, and household kitchen furniture. At the same time will be sold valuable Negroes. This is just some of the pages from the inventory of that sale. Each line has a description, the price paid, and to whom the item was sold. At the very end of the inventory for the John Geyer's part of the estate, I found this. This list confirms another part of Harry Bird's story, that there were 10 people left behind, sold, 6 adults and 4 children. According to an eyewitness, and I'm going to be quoting from a letter that I found, the first to be sold was Julia. She carried an infant in her arms and 2 other children with her. They were all sold for $1,103 to William W. Clinton. Next was Maria and her child. They were sold for $905. Next was Lucinda, or Lucy. She went to St. Clair Graves of Madison County, Virginia for $580. Mary was next. She came out trembling and crying. A local farmer, Mr. Screebert, wanted her, but the Negro traders run her up to such a price as Mr. Screebert could not give. When she cried so very much, that impudent trader, St. Clair Graves, cried out $10 more because she can cry so pretty. Her price was $506. Then came the sale of the men. One of them, Robert, had been put in jail to prevent him from running off. He was sold in his jail cell for $1,080 to St. Clair Graves. And then old Harry, who was the father of some of the children, had kept hidden before the sale so Christian Miller couldn't find him and put him in jail with Robert. Old Harry came back on the day of the sale because he expected to be bought by a local farmer, again, Mr. Screebert. Again, the price was too high for a local. The slave trader, St. Clair Graves, bought him for $525. Old Harry fought back, breaking free and running. Graves ran after him. Old Harry tried to get an axe, but Miller and Graves were right there. The slave trader severely beat old Harry with a club until the man was bleeding. Graves reportedly said that if Harry had touched the axe, he would have shot him down. Christian Miller wanted Harry Bird and George to be among those sold to the highest bidder, but he failed. I was in touch with local historians from Mexico, New York. They maintained a tin shop that was owned by abolitionist and Underground Railroad conductor Star Clark. They found an article in the Friend of Man about the fugitive George. We all got excited, hoping that it was more about George and Harry, but it was another person. So while that was a little disappointing for me, it was very good for the other person. At the end of Star Clark's letter, there is a little addendum, and it says, I hear often from George and Harry, the two that Judge Hayden had so much unbounded love for last winter. They are doing well. This is an approximation of the route they traveled, and it's a long one. And I want to thank you. That's it.
Deirdre, that was awesome. Thank you. And I know many of us are familiar with these stories and have looked into them ourselves, but you have brought out aspects that we didn't know. And I am really happy and really enjoyed where you were able to have slides depicting a lot of this. You have a lot more photos than I've seen, maps that I haven't seen before. One person in particular that I was unfamiliar with, the name was Lewis Lawrence, who you say was with Spencer Kellogg that day of the rescue. Where did you find out about him?
He was mentioned in Friend of Man, in an article about Friend of Man, and he was also said to be, as far as I can establish, several people were arrested after the Utica rescue, and he was one of them. But they went before Judge Dean, and nobody was prosecuted ultimately. They went before the judge, and nobody was sentenced or found guilty. I can't quite figure out why, but and he went on, he was at the 1835 founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society, and he was described in an obit as a friend of the people of color all his life.
A really, really nice addition to our history here. I would like to open it up to more questions. I'm going to there's a question on the chat from Judith Wellman. Did anything at all happen to those who drove the New York State Anti-Slavery Society out of the Bleecker Street Church? So the rioters, those gentlemen of property and standing, did anything happen to any of them?
I have found no one arrested for anything. There were people arrested no, there were some people arrested. I think they were not, of course, it wasn't the gentlemen who were arrested. It might have been those who went on after drinking in the streets and threatening to burn down Alvin Stewart's house and stuff like that. I'm not sure exactly who was arrested because they don't seem to list it in the newspapers in any that I've found at any rate.
Folks, you are welcome to unmute yourself if you have a question. You can also, as Judith did, put it in the chat. I am monitoring the chat and would be happy to ask Deirdre any questions that you come up with.
It's Leslie here. I just want to say, Jan, it was great. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. And Jan, it was interesting. Some of the things you talked about on your walking tour. It was so nice to see some of the places in the presentation. But my comment is that I love the fact, talking about the abolitionist, as I go forward with my tours, I try to bring in the abolition part of the tour as much as I can. And this has just added so much more to it. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm glad you were here.
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
Jim Hotchkiss here. I want to look at the replay because there were some things in there that I missed and I wanted to get them correct. Sage, is the audio going to be bad on the recording also?
I would think it would be because he's just recording what happened, and maybe we
Yeah.
could do a voiceover or something, do a little bit of work on it.
That'd be good, thank you.
Are you reading from a script on the screen? Are you reading from it
Yes.
under the computer? Well, because I'm thinking of doing the same thing. I'm so used to being spontaneous that I'm thinking, no, I ought to make a point for every different slide I show. I ought to have at least a couple reasons for showing that slide. So are you looking at something in front of you on the desk or something like that?
I can explain it to you off. I have two monitors. One
Uh,
that's showing the PowerPoint and one that has the camera and my talk, and I'm just scrolling through.
I have a question for Deirdre or Jan about which of these sites are still standing in Utica. We're doing a survey related to abolitionism, African-American life in the Underground Railroad in Oneida County. And could you talk a bit about which of the sites are still there and which are not?
Well, it feels to me like most everything is gone, like all three of those lovely churches gone. The streets that the churches were on, the one that the First Presbyterian Church, Washington and Liberty, the streets don't even exist anymore. The building where Alvin Stewart's office was, that's there. The building where Judge Hayden's court was, that's there. I don't know, there's other buildings that are in that same era that are there. Jan, do you think there's any other actual existing ones that
yeah, that whole set of buildings, that masonry buildings, brick buildings from Stuart's building, which is now Great Rentals on the corner there, all the way to Utica Roasters, right past the Hayden building. Those are all contiguous. That's on the National Registry as being the oldest contiguous big brick structure in Utica. So I think that big tall thing, the facade covers up the original brick structure as well. So that's of historic value in and of itself. But we had to be sure that we had it narrowed down to the right building when we verified the Hayden building, in order to get it verified by the National Park Service as the site of the Utica rescue at Judge Hayden's building, because the addresses changed between then and now, and we didn't know what address it actually took place in until we traced it back to, including, among other things, the proof that all those buildings were built in 1833. And from that on, we could focus on, and sure enough, the original numbers were the address where the actual rescue took place. So that's really like the jewel in the crown of our Oneida County history of Abolition Underground Railroad, because it is still there. But there's so many other structures that really are still there, and we could go on about that.
Deirdre, I have a question.
Okay.
For a long time, I've wrestled with the matter of why some and not others. Even when I began my work in Briar Green, I wrestled with that. This fresh-faced, sandy-haired abolitionist. Do you have any sense, if you look at the Utica mob and the social economic makeup of Utica, why some became abolitionists and not others? Was it economic, religious persuasion? What made an abolitionist different in temperament, principle, conscience from a non-abolitionist? Is there any pattern that emerges?
The one that I understand from, like, there's not just, right, there's not just abolitionists and colonizationists, there's also the other mass of people. For instance, there was a meeting just days before the 1835 founding meeting of them in the mechanics hall, and they were all for the meeting going forward and did not feel that it should be stopped. So there were some people who were, neither hot nor cold about it. I mean, it's weird. Like, there's lawyers on both sides, future mayors on both sides. And so it feels to me like, in the same way that right now, like there's people out there who, they feel terrible about racism. They don't like it, but they're not doing anything about it. That somehow I just feel like it's people's experiences as they're coming up and how they might have been raised. Look at the split in religion. Like, it wasn't a matter of the religious people were abolitionists and the atheists weren't,
Right.
or, it's nothing to do with that. People had very devout religious beliefs. And so it seems to me like it's in part for white people, that it's got to be experience and just growing up and having a different kind of experience. But I've read the papers of Alvin Stewart and all of his autobiography, and I don't really find like a moment where he changed. And as a matter of fact, he was partially for the colonization thing in 1834 too. I mean, he got ridiculed for that later. Hey, he used to be for colonization. So I have no answer. I'm sorry, I can't solve your life.
I don't think there is a pattern, an easy pattern, but when I read the autobiographies or the memoirs or about these abolitionists, I'm looking for that moment where they had an awakening. Influence of parents, New England background, it's religious effect of the burned over district, revivals, what was it that, because if somehow we could isolate that and then try to extrapolate from that to the present moment for educational purposes, how do we take the current citizenry and awaken them to the need to become bearers of the light in our own day?
Yeah.
Milt, we can pinpoint maybe one of those aha moments with Robert Everett, because the story is told
right.
that fresh off the boat, if you will, on his way from New York City to this area, it was probably a pretty slow journey. He rode apparently part of the distance with an African-American driver who told him stories about enslavement. And by the time he arrived in Utica, he apparently had opened his mind to the idea of slavery. Of course, he was a very religious man as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was already a population of religious people who were very zealous in their anti-slavery sentiment. But that moment, it is said, is when he actually understood what slavery was all about. It was that little journey from New York City to Utica. But you had to, I think, have had contact somehow. That otherwise it's so abstract. You could live your whole life in New York, in Oneida County back then, and maybe run into half a dozen people of color in your whole life. If you wanted to, you could avoid them completely, inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why it was so important having the presentations by formerly enslaved people, because it really helped people who did not think of slavery to see what it actually was, to understand what it actually was. So yeah, I think you're right, Milt. It's the experiences that people have.
Religion is also key. Congregationalists were much more likely to be abolitionists than almost any other major group. And after Finney's revivals in Oneida County, all the anti-revivalist Presbyterians can change to the Congregational Association so they wouldn't be associated with revivals. So the question of revivals is a complicated one, but then I think it's really important, Baptists and Methodists also, especially with the Wesleyan Methodists breaking off in 43, it just split apart major congregations. And I think, as Deirdre mentioned, there's some sense that the rioters in Utica were politically inspired. They certainly were politically aggressive and ambitious. And may well have been Democrats. If we looked at the breakdown politically, I bet we'd see that. Leonard Richards, Gentleman of Property and Standing, deals with this some.
I
We
thought
did
his
mention
conclusion was kind of vague, though. Can you generalize about the people who were who were at the meeting to form the Anti-Slavery Society versus the rioters? And it still could find very few generalizations. Disproportionately people of religion, yeah, but still. So it was really, there's no real answer yet, Milt. I don't think we have an answer to generalize to.
Well, in the case of the Utica riot, Deirdre, am I correct that it may have been led or egged on by gentlemen of property and standing, but when Alvin Stewart's house was attacked and so on, it wasn't the gentlemen of property and standing who were doing that work. They got others to do the dirty deed. Is that correct?
Yeah, they had whipped up this whole element
With
of people.
alcohol, I guess, too.
They also paid for bars to be open that morning for drinking to happen. That was one of the things that was one of the accusations against them, that, you know, they had opened up the grog houses for people. So yeah, you get a crowd going and then you step aside and really you cannot control them after you got them going. You got them to this point and then you make yourself scarce because, you know, who knows what direction it could take after that, you know.
Well, we are coming up on our 5:45 mark. One last call if there's any last question for Deirdre before we finish our formal presentation session here.
Yeah, where did you use the pointer? How did you access the pointer that you used?
I think she can do that off here, Jan, and
my
give you a
mouse.
little tutorial.
That's
Right.
my mouse pointer.
Yeah, yeah. I think Deirdre's going to be able to help us all really amp up the technical parts of our presentation.
Yeah,
This was wonderful, Deirdre. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Yes,
I
much
really like the
appreciated.
way the maps make it pull.
Yes.
The maps really help to illustrate, I think. I'm
Thank you.
They
thinking
really,
about
they
how to
really
use
do.
my maps as well. Especially the old maps that have those little intricate little names printed on them.
I just want to say one thing, you know, I wish, wait a minute, if people do me 1 second, I just want to, I took that map, the one that's on the white paper from Pioneers of Utica, and I added the outline of the Ballyhoo Creek on the side. And I did that because I am doing a lot of locations in the novel. And oh boy, are you going to be able to see this? This is the, oh no, it's not going to do it. Maybe it is. No. I'm holding up my cell phone, but it's completely. Anyway, I put these maps into the novel so that people with the locations of the fictional places, some fictional and some real, because the maps make such a difference in terms of, like, if you're walking around Utica and trying to figure out where any of this was, and that this is the same sidewalk area where all of this happened. You know, I find that very exciting, that sort of proximal history, that right here, if you could stand still, like in a time machine, like the H.G. Wells movie, you know, the time machine, and just see what happens there. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And it really helps for people, even people who aren't here, being able to walk through the town, or just as we're reading, those of us who cannot visualize well, it really helps to show how close these things were. The map with, was it Alvin Stewart's house, and then all of the colonizationists around him, those things bring it home very much. And I think your presentation today did that on a lot of points for both of these. situation.
second that motion because that's what it did for me.
Mary, before we go, could we mention Jessica Harney's talk next week and also
Yeah.
Jen's coming up?
I certainly will. Deirdre, thank you once again. That was absolutely marvelous. This was the second presentation that the Underground Railroad Consortium is putting on. Our third presentation, we don't have the final date yet. We, of course, will certainly let you know. That will be given by Jan Diamicis. Dr. Diamicis will be speaking on looking for Joshua Howe, the Underground Railroad in Oneida County. So we're looking forward to that. He's done extensive research on the freedom seeker Joshua Howe and his time here in Oneida County. We do know the date for another wonderful presentation coming up. It's October 14th. It's going to be virtual as well. It's put on by the Oneida County History Center. And Jessica Haney, who is a member of the National Abolition Hall of Fame Board and also the Oneida County Freedom Trail, is going to be doing a presentation on the Florence Farming Association. And she and her students, she is a high school social studies teacher, have done extensive research and have a Pomeroy marker placed at the site. So there'll be a lot of new information to us, I think to a lot of us at that talk. You can go to the Oneida County History Center website and sign up for that in order to get the link. And again, that's October 14th. And on behalf of the whole consortium, I want to thank everyone who joined us. And I'll let you know, you don't have to sign off right this moment. We are going to end the recording in the official part, but if any of you would like to hang on and have some more chat, please feel welcome to do that. So thank you all for coming, and Sage, thank you for taking care of all of the tech.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, when something like that happens, with the sound quality all of a sudden going crazy, should we just soldier on, or should we stop the whole thing?
We should stop.
Yeah,
I agree.
I was only alerted because Sage texted me and I had my phone right here. So I couldn't tell.
Part of the reason we all were putting it in the chat. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a tech person who could get in touch with you a different way.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to monitor the chat, you're giving your presentation. We did let
You do
Sage know, and it was also happening on his
You
end.
do
So
realize we're still recording, right?
yes,
we're
I know
still
Sage will
recording.
have to take care of that.
Okay.
Deidre,
Yes.
do you know what the bandwidth is at your home? Because here out in the country in Casanova, I don't have much bandwidth. I don't know if I could even do this.
You
Well,
sound fine, Milt.
yeah, you have sounded fine and your picture came through fine. We just have a
But if I have
cable modem.
If I have a presentation up, won't that take up more bandwidth?
Sage, what do you think?
I wonder if by having two screens staged, do you think that made any difference?
I have a feeling Sage is somewhere else.
Yeah, I think he's had to step away for a minute.
Yeah.
Someone made a comment, Deirdre, in the chat, that maybe your virtual background, if you had turned that off, maybe that was taking up some. I don't know. I'm just getting.
It felt like when she moved around or did something like she was moving around. That's when. I don't know what you were doing at the time, but it seemed like, because sometimes it was really good, but then you seemed to be moving around or something changed.
Yeah.
And that's when you would get garbled. So I don't know what was happening, but that's what it seemed like.
Yeah.
Otherwise you were great. There weren't any issues.
Well, I'll just re-record we'll find the sections and I'll re-record and re-record maybe with Sage and that'll work out better. But I don't know, Milt, in terms of just trying to test it somehow. We can all set up a testing thing where we just get a Zoom meeting going and you give it a shot and see what happens.
I think Milt, I think you'd be fine because you sounded great today and you look great. So I would think
Yeah.
you'd work fine.
Well, thank you for telling me I look great, but
Well, not right now, because is that you?
well, here's me. There.
There
Yeah.
you go. See? Perfect.
But I'm
As
wondering
young as ever.
when I'm sharing a screen with content in it, that'll take up additional bandwidth.
You'll have to try it, Milt. There's no way except trying it.
Right.
My internet went out last week and I had to give a talk, so I ended up in my van, which has solar power to plug the computer in the parking lot of Dunkin' Donuts, using the Dunkin' Donuts internet, and it was getting dark, so I sat there in the dark giving this PowerPoint thing. Honestly, you do what you got to do.
No kidding.
So should we be signaling the person or something when that starts to happen?
Yeah,
Or should
maybe we
someone
should
do
have a
that?
signal.
Should Mary do that?
Yeah,
Well,
I wasn't-
actually, I think maybe Sage as the tech person. I mean, I can do it as well, but I would have to. So what happened today, and when Sage texted Deirdre, I think that's well, Jan doesn't have text. With Jan, it'll have to be something else. But that's what I usually do when I'm on a Zoom meeting, and if we're not watching the chat, I send texts to people. I mean, not just me. I mean, that's what a lot of people do. That's one.
So whoever does a
presented.
presentation has a cell phone.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. So where's
I would
Jan
not
does
have
it?
seen- I would not have seen people waving or anything like that because I was staring at my.
Ah, that's right.
Exactly,
That's right.
exactly.
Yeah, and
So-
I don't usually have the cell phone on, so let's make that something we remind the speakers to have your cell phone available.
Right.
I'll
Well, for Jan, it won't work because Jan
I'll
doesn't have
have
a
to
cell
figure
phone.
out how to do that. I'll do that between now and then.
Okay, well, we'll think, well, if you use your sons or your wives, maybe we can.
I have one. I just don't
Oh.
use it.
Okay.
Oh,
I don't know how to text or anything like that, but
But
you
we
won't
I
can
have
would
to
think
learn.
know how to-
about something, a different way for you, Jan, because you will be handling it differently than Deirdre was. You won't have two screens up, et cetera. So yeah, we're gonna have to try to figure out
Yeah.
what would work.
We
This
need a
is
run-
fantastic, though.
Mhm.
This is such a help. It's so timely that this is happening. And I
think so
can't-
too.
I want to get the link so I can share it with other people. And as we talked about in the meeting the other day, well, I said that in dealing with the whole Black Lives Matter and race relations, I think it's so important to bring out the abolitionist story for
Mhm.
me and
I
the groups
agree.
that I have on tours. I just think this is awesome. Awesome. Because I don't think I'm trying to explain it to people that it wasn't, when they start talking bad about white people, I try and explain it to them. And this is so helpful to me for what I'm trying to do on my journey with all of this stuff. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mhm. Thank you all.
Leslie.
See you soon. See you next week.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay,
take care.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Okay,
Thank
Bye.
you.
Take care, Deirdre. Nice
Thank
job.
you for
Mary, nice
everything.
job.
yes.